In this lesson, we'll learn how we can start to introduce forces and other types of particle behaviors in 3ds Max. Alright, so as you're starting to work with particles and getting your particle simulation set up in 3ds Max, you'll probably find yourself in situations where you want to start to add some external forces, things like gravity or wind, into your simulation. So we can start to do that in 3ds Max. If we go into our Create menu, let's go over to the Space Warps, click on that, and we can start to add in forces from this pull-down menu. So let's start to add in something like gravity. So we'll click this. We can drop in our gravity pretty much anywhere we want. So draw this out, and then right-click whenever we're done. Now, as we start to scrub through here, you'll notice that the gravity really has not had any kind of an effect on our particles. That's because in order for any of these forces to have any kind of an effect, they actually need to be explicitly connected to our particle simulation. So the way that we do that in 3ds Max is to first select our particles that we actually want to interact with our force. With these selected, let's go to the Bind to Space Warp option. Click on that, and now you'll notice whenever we move our cursor over any kind of a particle system that my icon will change. So all we have to do is click and drag onto the actual space warp that we want to affect, and again, you'll notice that my cursor changes once I hover over this. As soon as I let off my mouse button, you'll notice that for just a moment, this space warp will actually change color. So as I let off my mouse, you'll notice that temporarily this should change color to white, and as soon as we make that connection, you'll notice that the gravity is now pulling these particles down. Alright, so in my case, that's pulling these down with quite a bit of force. So let's go back to my selection. I'll grab this gravity space warp. Let's go into the modify for this, and we can start to adjust the strength of this. So if we wanted this to have maybe much less of an effect, as far as pulling these particles down much more gently, we can start to lower the overall strength of this gravity. And if we also wanted, we could start to come to this actual emitter itself, and maybe actually make a few minor little adjustments to this if we actually wanted the particles to emit in a slightly upward direction to kind of compensate for that pulling down effect. Or you may also find yourself in a situation where maybe you don't need the space warp in here at all. But I definitely did want to show you, if you ever did need that kind of a space warp or that kind of effect, how you actually are going to need to connect that up. Alright, so again, maybe just a very subtle effect of gravity on this. Alright, now let's start to actually take a look at what these particles will look like once they're rendered out. So I'm just going to go into my perspective view, swing my camera around, and let's go over to this menu up top and render this out. Alright, now you'll see that once the render completes that we really just kind of see a few little spots, just a few little pixels in here. So what we're actually getting as far as the render is concerned really doesn't match what we see here in the viewport. So let's change that. Let's select these particles. Let's go into the Super Spray, and again, once you go into the Modify menu, you should see that once your gravity or any other forces have been bound to your particles, you should see that gravity binding or binding to any other force listed here as well. So let's go into the Super Spray, and in the Viewport display, you can see right now it's set to Ticks. Let's set this to Mesh. Alright, and now we can actually see what is going to be rendered out. So what we get are really just these little spots in here. So let's start to actually make some adjustments to the size of these particles. So let's scroll down a little bit, and we have control over the particle size here. So as we start to bring this up, we should start to see our particles getting quite a bit larger. And whenever we render this out, you can see now that matches what we should actually get in the render. So when it comes to now beginning to adjust your particles, the density, things like that, this is going to make it much, much easier. Now at the moment we are just emitting out these triangles. Now in my case I really don't want to do that because I'm trying to emit something that looks more like smoke. This is going to work best instead of using a triangle. We can start to change this out and start to again make some adjustments on this. If we wanted to use stars, cubes, spheres, we could do all of those things. When it comes to simulating the look of things like smoke, I find that a good option to use is this facing option. Now, what this will essentially do is make a whole bunch of individual planes, and it will always keep those oriented right toward the camera. So now we can start to apply textures and things like that to just these individual planes. And again, if I were to swing the camera around, you can start to see just what that looks like. At the moment, you can see they are not oriented toward the camera, but as soon as I scrub through here and start to update my playback, you can see they will snap their orientation back to whatever view you happen to be looking through. Alright, so now that we have an idea of just what these look like, again, we can start to get a little bit better idea of any adjustments that we need to make. So looking at the particle emission, you can see they start off really, really small, so we get these tiny little particles. So I'm going to go back to my super spray. Let's go into the modifiers and start to adjust our size up a little bit higher. So that way we start to get some better particles here to begin with. But you can see that my particles start to get really, really large as we start to get further back. So now we can start to adjust this grow option. So that way they can start to gradually start to get a little bit larger. You can see right now they're set to actually grow for about 10 frames by default, which means during the course of these 10 frames, which is right about here, these particles will now reach their full size. Now if we wanted this to take much longer, we could set this to something like 50 or maybe even 60, and that way this growth of our particles is much more gradual. And we can also set these particles to actually begin fading toward the end of their life, so as they start to die, they start to get smaller and smaller. In my case, I'll probably go ahead and bring this down to 0, so that way they really don't get smaller, they just eventually will kind of fade out. Alright, so now that we have our particle behavior pretty well set up, what we'll start to do in our next lesson is begin to tackle one of the most important parts of pulling off some kind of a believable smoke effect, which is the actual shading and rendering of these particles. So we'll start to take a look at that process in our next lesson.